Thank you so much for the invitation to join. I will walk around as I talk. So if you need me to move so that you can see the closed captioning, please just signal to me and I will try and move out of your way. Similarly, we tested the mics earlier, and if at the back you can't hear me, okay, good, you can do just that. Thank you very much. If at any point I stop using a little bit of my teacher voice, then feel free to just use this motion and I will try and talk a little bit louder. So as Gavin mentioned, I'm an academic integrity scholar. My background started with studying plagiarism. I'm a humanities scholar by training, and then went to the School of Education to study leadership, policy, and governance, where most of my research, well, some of my research has focused on academic misconduct policies and other policies in education. Today's talk is grounded in 3 published works. First is the second Handbook of Academic Integrity, and we have some contributors to the handbook here. I believe. So if you contributed, if you wouldn't mind me calling you out to raise your hand, unless they've already left. They've already left. Okay, that's fine. That didn't take long. We also have Academic Integrity in Canada. Should you be so inclined to need some bedside reading, all 600 pages of Academic Integrity in Canada is available free of charge. This is an open access publication, thanks to my co-editor, Dr. Julia Christensen-Hughes, who sponsored the open access fees from Springer. So that book is available for anyone to look at. And then the other one is Plagiarism in Higher Education. There's a couple of funded projects, a SOTL project at the University of Calgary, and then a SHRC project on artificial intelligence. If anyone had told me when I started my career that I would end up studying artificial intelligence, I would have thought they were bonkers because of my background in literature. And it was writing Plagiarism in Higher Education that took me into that world. So I've always been tech curious, sort of a tech enthusiast, but certainly in some ways I still feel that I have no business studying AI. However, as I was writing Plagiarism in Higher Education, which was due to the publisher in May of 2020, you may remember that was the time that we were all sequestered in our houses during COVID-19, I started thinking much more about the future of plagiarism and what it meant. And that took me into thinking about generative AI and its implications for writing and plagiarism. So I've now been in this world for about half a decade. And I'll take a little pause and talk about the SOTL project that we did at the University of Calgary, which is the icon or the square on the top, the red and white one. It was a project about academic integrity and AI that was a result of the book, and wanted to study how those two were connected, and pulled together a team at U of C, a transdisciplinary. A colleague from engineering, Dr. Bob Brennan, a colleague from the Faculty of Arts, the Department of English Creative Writing, Jason Weens, and then another collaborator that I'll tell you about in just a moment. So pulling together this team, Jason from English thought that AI was the worst thing ever and needed to be banned immediately. Bob from engineering thought that AI was the greatest thing since sliced bread and needed to be incorporated into all courses immediately. And then our other collaborator was Dr. Brenda McDermott, who's the manager of student and accessibility services at the University of Calgary, and posed a question to us and said, if artificial intelligence technologies are assistive or adaptive technologies, could we be violating students' human rights if we try to deny them access? Well, that question stopped us all in our tracks because we were already getting entrenched in our polarized positions as a team, and what that question did was disrupt our polarized positions and invite us to pause and listen to each other. I can say, because my job as the PI was to wrangle all these cats, right? I can say that maybe none of us changed our positions entirely, but we became more tolerant of each other's perspectives. And certainly having someone on the team from Student Accessibility Services brought a new lens to the work that I think was ultimately very helpful. And since then have heard more of the polarized positions, and if you fall into one of those categories, I'm not here to dissuade you one way or the other, but simply to invite all of us to keep an open mind as we keep going with this. So that leads us to setting the stage today, and I'm just realizing there's an awful lot of text on this slide, so I'll summarize for you. Basically, to acknowledge there are many ethical dilemmas with generative AI. We will not solve them all today. I will not even talk about them all today, but acknowledging that there are many and they are worthwhile to discuss, from the environmental impact of these tools to the workforces that may have been exploited to build the databases associated with them, to gender bias, et cetera, et cetera. So Gavin only gave me an hour, so we won't be able to go into all of them, but recognizing that there are so many ethical dilemmas that aren't going to go away anytime soon, and we won't solve them today, this week, or even this year. So I'm going to stay in my lane and talk about academic integrity specifically. Okay, and also acknowledging that academic integrity in the last couple of years seems to have become entangled with and almost synonymous with generative AI. However, academic misconduct has been around for a long time, right? And so there are still historical things that need to be addressed and talked about. I'd like to start by kind of setting the stage and tell you about one of my pet peeves. One of my pet peeves is when a colleague walks into a meeting and says, I'm dealing with a case of academic integrity. Or I've got this other thing that I've got to this hassle with academic integrity. I would like to contend that academic integrity is worth celebrating and to be encouraged with our students. The term academic integrity was popularized in the 1990s by a fellow named Don McCabe, who is a co-founder of the International Center for Academic Integrity, and it was really to put a positive spin on deficit-based language. And it really became popularized in the 90s, around the time that popular psychology and self-help became popularized, but it's really about setting our expectations with students, teaching them the skills they need for academic success, citing, referencing, etc. But if you've been in this game any length of time, there comes a point where you go, oh, something's just happened. You either know because you've seen the crib notes in the exam, or you suspect that something has gone horribly wrong. This continuum that I put together with a couple of grad students and we called this the critical incident moment. This moment where we, as instructors, think, what do I do now? Is there a policy? Is there a procedure? Do I report this? Do I not report this? What impact might this have on the student's future if I report them? Is this worth my time? Is this worth my hassle? We called this the gray zone, and did some research on this, small-scale research at the University of Calgary, and found largely that our colleagues experienced a fair amount of emotional labor when it came to that moment of discovering or suspecting that there had been a misconduct. If a person chooses to report it, we would then move into the part of the continuum where we're talking about misconduct. We don't need to whitewash it and call it academic integrity, because at that point it's not. It's a breach of integrity or a violation of integrity, but it's not integrity. It's misconduct, and we can call it that. This is the part of the continuum where we might be dealing with investigations, case management, sanctioning, appeals, and so forth. So to understand the continuum, our place in the continuum, and also the vocabulary that goes along with using these different terms in the ways in which they're meant to be used. And I also want to draw on the work of an American scholar who's not in academic integrity, but she does have a fascinating book just called Cheating. The first section of the book is about financial fraud. The second section of the book is about intimate relationship cheating. And the third part of the book is about academic cheating. I think it's fascinating. Her name's Deborah Rohde. She talks about this bell curve of cheating. And certainly she doesn't have this exact diagram in her book, so I clumsily put together a bell curve. And at one end of the bell curve, we see people who do not cheat, ever. No financial fraud, no cheating on their taxes, no intimate relationship cheating. This part of the population is a pretty small part of the population. They are outliers on the bell curve, if you will. 5 to 10% of the population. And then there's this idea of everybody else in the world is cheating. Certainly, if you've been in higher education, you've seen lots of students cheating, you've seen some media headlines, you might have heard about an epidemic of cheating. I can tell you from having studied the historical records dating back to the 1800s in terms of newspaper articles and other things, this so-called epidemic has been ongoing for more than 100 years. And we see these newspaper headlines that talk about increases in plagiarism. Like at some point we get to an increase of more than 100% because every headline sort of gives this sensationalist idea that all students are cheating all the time. If you believe in the bell curve, then you will know that the students who intentionally and repeatedly cheat without remorse, without taking responsibility, are at the other end of the bell curve, another 5 to 10% of the population. I just told you I'm a humanist, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I might imagine that this percentage of the population might have some kind of pathology here, and no matter what we do, those students will keep cheating. Just as at the other end of the bell curve, some students that never cheat could probably also not be persuaded to cheat. And in the middle, there's the rest of us. And I say the rest of us because this is the normal part of the bell curve, the 80% or so of the students. Or another way I like to tell this story is, despite what my husband may claim, I am normal. I remember cheating, copying from the Encyclopedia Britannica in grade 3. Yeah, I know, it tells you how old I am, right? First, I was using a pencil. Second of all, there was an encyclopedia. It's a lot of disclosure in the first 10 minutes. But it was a geography assignment, and I felt I couldn't say it any better than what was in the encyclopedia, and I didn't like the assignment. I thought it was stupid, so I just copied it, and I didn't get caught, and I keep confessing and confessing and confessing. At some point, I may be forgiven. So my point to you is this. Maybe you are an outlier. Maybe you've never cheated at anything in your entire life. But let me tell you, if this is you, most of your students are not like you. If you are at the other end of the bell curve, and there's some kind of pathology there, please don't tell us. It could be that you too are normal, and that maybe at some point you've copied, you've run a yellow light, you've fudged on your taxes. I don't know, and I don't need to know, and I don't need to be your confessor. But nevertheless, to say that this bell curve exists in society with various kinds of cheating, and it exists among our student population. So I have a colleague from the University of Swansea, and he puts it in a very simple and elegant way. And he says, people cheat, and students are people. So this will help you to frame where I'm coming from for the rest of the talk. So Gavin mentioned some of the values around academic integrity. I'll share some of them with you today. At the beginning, I mentioned the International Center for Academic Integrity, which was founded in the late 90s, co-founded by a man named Don McCabe, who was hugely influential in our field. This center framed a set of 6 values for students to start positive conversations: courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. You can see how these values could serve as a starting point for productive conversations with students about what does it mean to learn ethically. I think it could also serve as a great conversation starter with students about what does it mean for us to teach ethically. It's a question I think students haven't often been asked. And understanding what do the values mean to them as individuals and as humans. Often these have been framed in almost an absolute way, in a very sort of historical way within Western education, often around students' responsibilities. For example, it is the student's responsibility to know what plagiarism is and to not plagiarize. It is the student's responsibility to know and follow the procedures and policies for academic integrity at the institution. I can tell you from some of the research we've done, some of the students don't even know that such policies exist. And if they know that they exist, they often don't know where to find them. But responsibility can also be defined in other ways. Students may have responsibilities to their social and peer groups to help them succeed, to share their notes, to share their test answers or their assignments. Sometimes when I bring this idea of responsibility forward, or particular student groups having this responsibility, one thing that I've heard from colleagues is, yes, students from certain cultures, other cultures, have this responsibility to help their fellow students. We call it collusion. I can tell you that there is ample evidence in Canadian and American higher education to show that students who are born in Canada and the US also engage in these sharing behaviors. There's a historical practice and a phrase we don't use much more called frat files. That's a pejorative term. And I will preface the next story that I'm about to tell by saying that I have the utmost respect for individuals who are part of Greek societies, fraternities, and sororities. There's a long-standing practice that's been documented going back about 100 years in American higher education, in which members of Greek societies were expected to share their tests and assignments and papers with other members of their societies. Historically, the papers would have been stored in boxes in the houses, the sorority or fraternity houses where the members were. Now they would be stored, for example, in a Google Drive. There was an expectation for members to share with one another and help each other as members of the society. You may not be a member of a Greek society, or you may. You may have had this experience or not. But even if you didn't, could you imagine yourself being part of a closed and close social society or network where the expectation was on you to share and help your peers? And what if you didn't? What if you were the person that refused to add your test papers or your essays to the box of papers that everybody got to access and share? Would you be a social pariah? Maybe. The pressure on students to share and help each other is, and has been for a long time, enormous. So what we might call collusion or inappropriate sharing is a social pressure on our students that existed when I was a student, may have existed when you were a student, and still exists today. So when we talk about responsibilities and other forms of values, it's worthwhile to ask our students, what really do these values mean to you in an operational way, in a lived experience way? What are your responsibilities to each other? Because I can tell you, students have responsibilities that extend far beyond knowing the plagiarism policy and how to follow it. This organization, the International Center for Academic Integrity, does excellent work, and their values and resources are used all over the world. A couple of years ago, I was with a former director of the center, and we were both teaching in Turkey in a summer school for academic integrity. And we started a conversation about the differences between academic integrity in the United States and academic integrity in Canada. As we were walking along, had this wonderful discussion about it. And it turned into a book chapter in the handbook. And in listening to Teddy Fishman, what we sort of disentangled was, and this may surprise you, that there were polarized positions in the United States. There was one school of thought, led largely by Don McCabe and others who are heavily involved with the International Center for Academic Integrity, that come from a values and morality school of thought. The character education folks, if you will. Character education is not taught in many places anymore, but this idea of if we have the right values and only we can make the right decision, maybe we'll all be positive outliers on the bell curve and we'll always make the right decisions. And then there was another school of thought, led largely by a woman named Rebecca Moore Howard, who is a compositionist and worked a lot with international students, who was very adamant and said, academic integrity and plagiarism in particular has nothing to do with morality. You can plagiarize and still be a good person. In other words, you might be normal. According to Howard and her colleagues, academic integrity is about skill development and helping students learn paraphrasing, citing, referencing academic traditions that within a discipline and what is expected of them. So these two schools of thought exist in the United States. Interestingly, the two main scholars in the field, Don McCabe and Rebecca Moore Howard, never worked together. even though they worked at the same time in the 90s and the early 2000s. And interestingly, Don McCabe was a business professor at Rutgers, so in New Jersey, I think. And then right across the state line, thank you, in Syracuse, New York, at Syracuse University was Rebecca Moore Howard. They were literally across the state line from each other and never had a debate or conversation. And I know this anecdotally from having talked with Becky Moore Howard. McCabe passed away some years ago. But it was fascinating to me that you had these two sort of big voices in the field, and they never sort of sat down and hashed out their ideas over a coffee. So let me ask you, where are you on this? Are you in the values and morality side of things? Or are you in the skills development camp? Often when I talk to Canadians, and I'm stereotyping, what I hear is, sort of centrist. And that may be you as well. Could depend on the situation. So as Gavin mentioned, yes, I will talk about yet another framing that has come into the discourse around academic integrity in recent years. We were fortunate at University of Calgary to work with an Indigenous scholar by the name of Keyta Gladue. Keyta finds her roots in the Sucker Creek Cree Nation in Treaty 8 territory and the Métis Nation of the Red River. We asked if she would lead a project around academic integrity at the University of Calgary, and she agreed. She developed this original iconography at the top, and I've taken these screenshots from the PDF version of her work, so that's why it's a little bit small. There's also a website, and at Keyta's request, she told the story of how she came to do this work in a webinar, and the digital story is archived in a YouTube channel. So if you look up Keyta Gladue and Indigenous Academic Integrity, you will find this project. I'll briefly summarize some of the points she brought together. So she talks at the top about the braid of each of us being interwoven with each other in social relationships as relationality. I am because you are. I am because you are. I am because my teachers were. And you are because you will then teach others who come after you. The idea of us being interwoven with each other as a starting point for the conversations and the learning that we do. The next is relationality and the roles that we serve. Reciprocity and the roles that we serve. This idea of giving to one another in generous ways in which we don't expect others necessarily to give back to us. This is represented here by the interconnected hoops in different colors. And then finally, respect, with the diamonds representing squares on a blanket. And the respect here is very different from the respect of framing that's historically been related to academic integrity as respect for the rules, respect for the teacher, respect for authority, but rather respect as being nothing about us without us. So incorporating Indigenous voices into our conversations about academic integrity and understanding and challenging the colonial roots, not only of our education system, but that also underpin academic misconduct. Because we can see that some of those colonial roots in education are still used in academic misconduct policies, procedures, and sanctions today. So that's a little bit of the values. You can think about how might the Indigenous values of this land impact and inform the work that we do when we talk about misconduct and what it means. So I told you a little bit about the book that I did on plagiarism. What I want to do is just kind of go back to that book and frame a conversation about the history of plagiarism. I'll keep it brief for the non-historians in the room. But the idea of the impact of the printing press around 1450-ish, depending, and I will just start with a disclaimer and say my knowledge of plagiarism is informed and biased by being someone of European heritage. So what I know about plagiarism and writing comes from that, that framing. So around the time of the printing press, we know that literacy rates began and that individuals could start reading the Bible, for example, which they never could before, the impact of the Protestant Reformation on reading and literacy, etc. There's a wonderful book on plagiarism by a fellow named Thomas Mallon. He talks about this time in history, and he says, if I'm paraphrasing his work correctly, plagiarism was not a matter for litigation, but for laughter. Back in the days of the printing press, if you plagiarized from someone, you were mocked and ridiculed for not being clever enough to come up with your own original ideas. You may have been shunned socially. But the idea of litigating or punishing plagiarism didn't come in until about 100 years after, with the Statute of Anne, when copyright became embedded and entangled with plagiarism in ways that it's never become unentangled. But the idea of thinking about plagiarism as having a social consequence rather than a legal one is probably, that is an old tradition. So things have shifted. And things shifted again in the Industrial Revolution when education became massified for the first time. And we think about education at that time as being, I'm sort of lumping here Industrial Revolution with colonialism not far after, behavior control. We all know the story that the school bell started as a way to reflect life in the factories and to train people to respond to those whistles in the factories. And obedience, rule compliance, paying attention were all part of that educational system that became later embedded in the colonial education system. And punishing students for doing bad things was part of this system. And as much as we like to think we moved away from Industrial Revolution and colonial approaches to education, I would like to say that student conduct is one area that remains, in my opinion, deeply colonized, because we still very much have a sense of you do something wrong and you receive a punishment, a cause and effect. We haven't yet done the work of decolonizing academic integrity. But then we can fast forward another 500 years and think about the impact of the internet 30 years ago. So this was my generation when I started teaching about 30 years ago. The internet changed everything forever. And I remember having a conversation in the hallway of the languages department at the University of Calgary. We were chatting, another colleague came up to us and said, "Can we just turn this goddamn thing off?" And we said, the internet? No, you can't turn it off. But that was one line of thinking 30 years ago, was people were overwhelmed and frustrated and wanted to turn off this thing. At the time, words like cyber plagiarism really bubbled up. Anybody still using that term? No, I didn't think so, right? Cut and paste plagiarism didn't exist before the internet, because cutting and pasting didn't exist. Before that, there was people like me copying by hand from the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? And so the internet changed how we teach, how we learn, how we live, and how we plagiarize. It made plagiarism faster and more efficient than any generation previous. So it's probably a good time to then to kind of talk about the academic integrity arms race. I will frame this from the technology that was most prevalent when I started teaching, the internet, but you might think of it as well for artificial intelligence. So we'll start with this at the top. A new technology comes on the scene, the internet. There's all kinds of different reactions and perceptions. People are excited, people are nervous, those polarized positions of, can we get rid of this? No, we must incorporate it. Every possible emotion existed when the internet came into our classrooms. And then we started thinking, and this is the green arrow at the top, how do we incorporate this into teaching and learning? And it broke our brains. In some cases, it broke our hearts. It broke our budgets as well. But over time, we started to slowly incorporate the internet into our teaching. Can you imagine doing your job now without the internet, right? I don't know about you, but when the Wi-Fi goes down at the University of Calgary, people leave campus. We all go somewhere where there's internet, at home, Starbucks, somewhere else. And as we are experimenting with teaching and assessment in new ways, our students are experimenting with learning in new ways, and everybody in the world is experimenting with this new technology for misbehaving as well, and new forms of cheating come forward, like cyber plagiarism at the time. So this whole line of experimentation comes in. I should have probably asked if you have text matching software here. Yeah. Shh. Okay. Okay, I'm hugely unpopular with that company. I will just declare that. That's okay. Because about 30 years ago, we saw the emergence of what I would call anti-cheating technology or anti-cheating tools. I try not to mention specific companies, but Gavin's just done it for me. Thank you. So these companies come in, and they'll make us promises. And they'll say, if you only use our software, which is a pretty expensive license, we will solve the misconduct problem for you. We will be able to provide you with originality reports, and we have other tools that will produce reports that you can tell if a student has been cheating. And like the analogy that I make is sort of like an X-ray. So when we go to the doctor and we get an X-ray, the report or the X-ray doesn't tell us if we have cancer. That takes someone who is medically qualified to be able to read the report and understand what's happening in order to make a diagnosis. In a way, plagiarism is like a diagnosis of misconduct. It takes a qualified individual, us, to make the determination if there's been plagiarism. You cannot simply look at a report, look at an originality score, and say, aha, this person is an outlier on the bell curve, a bad person, a pathological cheater. That person could be struggling academically, need our support, need something else. It takes a human to interpret the report. Nevertheless, the companies came on the scene 30 years ago, promised that if we licensed the products, that all misconduct would disappear. I can tell you it hasn't. I think you're probably with me on this one. In part because our students are smart. And as fast as companies produce technology to so-called catch cheating, students will find workarounds and hacks to that same technology. You can find a plethora of YouTube channels, Reddit conversations, and back in the day we called them bulletin board discussions on how to hack these companies or circumvent them. Our students today are doing the same thing with artificial intelligence and Gen AI. The number of websites that have been created to humanize AI are rampant. So every technology that comes in with a promise of solving cheating has failed. Because if you ask me, the promise of this detection software will always fail. Because human cheating isn't a technology problem, it's a human one. In the meantime, the companies, of course, keep selling their software to us. We keep believing them, and we keep hoping that one day their promise will come true and they will eradicate cheating. It has yet to happen. And some companies have promised that they have AI text detection tools. I won't go into it now, but suffice to say that there is ample evidence to show that the tools are limited and potentially biased in ways that can create false positives and false negatives for students. So tools to detect cheating are at best limited and for sure expensive. And if a university, unlike this one, comes to me and said, should we buy the latest anti-cheating software? My response is always, please instead take whatever budget you had allocated for that and invest in people. Invest in your teaching and learning center, because our students need us to show up for them more than they need technology to surveil them. Some years ago, worked with colleagues in Canada to look at academic misconduct policies across Canada, universities and colleges. We looked at 96 institutions, 160 documents, and the latest of these in this phase has just been published now on Western Canadian colleges. And we analyzed all of the discourse throughout all of these policies to find out what are we doing in Canada and what can we do better. So I will summarize the results for you in terms of how are we dealing with misconduct in Canada in a way that's pretty straightforward. We basically have 3 ways that we deal with academic misconduct in Canada. We have a punitive approach, which is one that will no doubt be familiar to many of us in this room. It's based on the idea of you do something wrong and there is a punishment for that. Right, so it has its roots in administrative justice, crime and punishment. It's pretty easy for institutions to track this approach. Number of offenses, number of sanctions, what were the sanctions? It is administratively clean and historically persistent. We also have this idea of progressive discipline, that first offense, minor sanction, second and subsequent offenses get harsher and harsher penalties until we get to the ultimate one, which is expulsion, or exclusion, as they call it in some places. In other words, the worst punishment you can get is that we decide that you no longer have a place in our universities and you are therefore effectively excommunicated. This is just about every university and college in Canada has this. Some universities will layer on what we would call an educative approach. There can be workshops, remedial or rehabilitative education for students, teaching citing, referencing, paraphrasing. These are the common ones. In addition, study skills, time management is kind of a big one for students, and we can layer this on with the idea that if only you take another workshop, then you too can be academically successful, and then you will no longer plagiarize or cheat, as it were. This is often layered on rather than is a substitute for a punitive approach. Some universities have started actively pursuing restorative resolutions to academic misconduct. MacEwan University in Alberta, Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Canada are, if you ask me, the best exemplars of excellence when it comes to looking at restorative resolutions for academic misconduct. I'm not an expert in this. We don't use it at our university. I wish we did. I've taken some basic training in it, but the idea sort of flips misconduct on its head and instead looks at what are the harms that may have been caused when a student has engaged in misconduct. And this can go back to the integrity continuum. Remember the gray zone in the middle where the instructor might feel upset, confused about what to do. They might feel personally hurt or injured. My student has plagiarized. I'm angry. The other students in the class may feel injured as well. Why can you get away with this for cheating when I've done my work honestly? So there can be a sense of injury and community disruption, for lack of a better word. And a restorative approach would look to repair the relationship in the community. It assumes that the individual is willing to take responsibility for whatever has gone wrong. So those at the outliers, if you will, the pathological cheaters, as we might call them, that show no remorse and are unwilling to take responsibility, a restorative resolution may not work in those cases. And in universities I've worked with that have used a restorative resolution, they also have the educative and the punitive measures because restorative won't work in all cases. The idea is that then the ultimate outcome is not exclusion, but inclusion. Because at the end we ask, what will it take for us to trust you and for you to trust us, to be part of this community, a learning community in an ongoing way? I don't know of other places in the world, well, there's a few places in the US that are using restorative resolutions for academic misconduct, but I think from what I can see is Canada is just starting, but in just starting, we are also leading. So if you are starting to have those conversations here, what I can tell you is keep having them, because I think they're important conversations. And although I would not want to conflate restorative resolutions with decolonization, there are some connections that are worthwhile. And if as a learning organization we say that we care about decolonization and we're not looking at how to decolonize academic misconduct, what are we waiting for? I'll let you think about that question through the rest of your teaching month. I also want to talk a little bit about sort of who cheats. What does the prevailing discourse say, and what does the actual evidence and research say? Who cheats, reality versus myth? Well, in my line of work, there are people that will insist that international students cheat more. If you've heard this discourse, I would invite you to pause, because what does the research actually say? Well, I can tell you that there is no research in Canada. What we have is from other countries, and so we're looking at adjacent data and results to inform our thinking. One of the biggest surveys that was done in this way was done by an Australian researcher named Tracy Bertag, a survey of 14,000 students in Australia, self-reported data. They found that international students and domestic students cheated at about the same rate. I'll say it again. International and domestic students, domestic being Australian, cheated at about the same rate. There was other research done in the United States that found that international students were 5 times more likely to be reported for cheating. So what we end up with if we look at this data and try and make sense of it, potentially, is a difference between who's engaging in cheating and who's getting reported for cheating. And this, we have no data. When I talk with Canadian colleagues here and say, might we begin to collect demographic data around this, it gets very messy, because what are we talking about when we talk about an international student? We'll get that into a second. But one conclusion we could potentially draw, I guess maybe it's a hypothesis, is that domestic students are simply better at not getting caught, because we know the system and we know how to work it. And I still need to be forgiven for cheating in grade 3. Thinking about gender studies, there is study after study that shows that men cheat more than women. In fact, I just had a debate about this with a colleague from the UK. These studies go back an awfully long time. Looking at some of the studies around academic cheating, it is true that men have cheated more than women. If we look at the data up until about 1950, when I say men and women, it's because I haven't seen any studies yet on anything other than binary genders. So we'll still talk about men and women in this case, because that's what the data show. Okay, so up until about the 1950s or 60s, men were cheating in universities more and more. And after, starting in about the 1960s, we start to see more and more women cheating in universities. And when I looked into that data, I was like, what happened? Why were more and more women cheating in universities? And then I have no empirical data to support this. Well, there might be. We know that correlation is not causation, but one observation I can make is that's about the time they started to let us in. So when you let a demographic group into a university or a learning system, rates of cheating in that demographic group will go up. However, if you are a man, you are more likely to be reported for cheating. So we can start to build a picture from adjacent data that tells us a story that if you are a man, and some other data will be coming up here, if you are a man, if you're a person of color, if you speak English as an additional language, you are significantly more likely to be reported for cheating than if you look and sound like I do. So who gets reported and who gets forgiven without ever being reported? We have no data in Canada, but think about your own experiences in your own classrooms and your own departments. Because I would like to suggest that when we use the term international students and cheating, we are not necessarily talking about international students in any legal sense. That is a legal term in Canada, an individual who has a study permit. If I say the words international students and cheating, are you thinking about an individual who was not white, not born in Canada, speaks English as an additional language? I would like to suggest that we use this term international student as a proxy for a cheating student who was born elsewhere. So we can check our biases and be very precise with our language again. And we were talking about who engages in misconduct and what are our perceptions around this. Because I can tell you that my colleague in the United Kingdom, Mary Davis, has actually dug into the demographic data in the UK and found that students from Asia and Africa in particular, 6 countries, are overrepresented in the academic misconduct reporting data. Overrepresentation meaning reported more often than others without a logical explanation as to why. And she found specifically that if you were an individual from Asia, from China, Pakistan, or India, you were much more likely to be reported for cheating than your white domestic English peers. And if you were from Kenya, Ghana, and in particular Nigeria, you were likely to be overrepresented in the misconduct reporting data. Who gets reported and who gets forgiven without ever being reported? We can't prove a negative, so we can't necessarily prove who's not getting reported. But we can turn back to the data from people like Bretag et al. That show that international and domestic students cheated at about the same rate. So let's think a little bit more about this. Some American colleagues talked about the impact on international students for academic misconduct. And they say that international students are less likely to be retained than domestic students following a finding of academic misconduct. I think, what does this mean? Less likely to be retained. It's kind of this whitewashing language again. We can think about students, the progressive discipline model for academic misconduct. Students might engage in suspension, might be suspended or expelled, voluntary withdrawal. In a worst case, death by suicide. This is something that we don't talk about in most of our universities. I know of no university anywhere in the world that's having difficult conversations about student mental health and academic misconduct and the impact on an individual for an allegation of misconduct. Not only a finding, but even an allegation. Have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do? Or maybe you were accused of something you did do, and the impact on our students and what that might have. Sometimes colleagues will say to me, yes, but what about the impact on me as an instructor and my mental health? And I agree, according to our continuum and the gray zone, this is another important part of our conversation. And for us as instructors, when we are feeling angry and overwhelmed and disrespected, when our students have cheated, this is legitimate and worthwhile to talk about. However, I would like to contend that students, as they are engaging in their moral development and other kinds of experiences, may need more support than as professionals that we might need, or they might need it differently, or we have access to things and supposedly understand what supports are available to us. And would like to suggest that when we are working with students, if there's an allegation of misconduct, to understand the impact this may have on an individual, whether or not that finding is justified. So what do we do? I think one of the things that we can do is we can consider a wraparound approach to academic integrity. This is a challenge to a historical disruption of thinking about misconduct in an antagonistic way. Students against teachers, teachers against administrators, or students against administrators. The adversarial responses of I, the teacher, am all-knowing, and you, the student, are not, and you will be subjected to punishment. In a wraparound approach to academic integrity, we take a more community-based approach and we hold the students in the center of that. We do not absolve them of their responsibilities. Okay, this is not absolute moral relativism or anarchy. We're simply saying that members of the academic community have responsibilities around academic integrity that don't start at the minute we think something's gone wrong, but rather through the life cycle of learning. So as educators, thinking about what constitutes fair assessment, how can I build fair assessment into my programs and my courses, and how can I think about my role in that? And for administrators, not only thinking about policies and procedures, but also thinking about including students in ways that might elevate and amplify and commit to nothing about us without us. And we know from some of the research that more and more of our students will demand of us that we exemplify integrity. It's not to say that we come to work having polished our halo, but rather when things go wrong, say, yep, we screwed up and we're going to work to make it better. And the role of professional staff in academic integrity is often under-celebrated. So those whose work includes setting up the meetings, retaining records, etc., have a role to play. And finally, community, industry, and government. In other countries, quality assurance bodies play a larger role in this than in Canada, but also thinking about the professional bodies and connecting academic integrity to professional conduct. I work in a faculty of education where in Alberta, teachers are subject to a code of ethics when they graduate from us. Same thing in engineering, nursing, and making the connection between industry and academia can be helpful. So I'm going to share with you in just a moment one other editorial here. Let me just go to it and let you use the QR code. So one of the things I've been starting to think on is the ways in which we can think more about student rights and human rights and the impact on students when there's a finding of misconduct. Oh, and by the way, in case I didn't mention it, there may be a quiz at the end of this talk. I hope you've been taking note. No, there might be a quiz. So this editorial is thinking about future-proofing academic integrity in the age of artificial intelligence. And this came to me after some work that I was doing, again, on AI, newcomer to this field. I read an annual editorial for the journal that I edit This was the most recent one that I did in 2024, thinking about future-proofing integrity in the age of AI and neurotechnology, and prioritizing human rights, dignity, and equity. This came to me after a project that I worked on with UNESCO. I'm part of the Women for Ethical AI platform, and last year we created the UNESCO Outlook Report, Gender Outlook Report on AI, looking at the impact of AI for women and girls in STEM, in industry. I worked on the policy piece, and we drew on the same methodology for the policy studies that I showed you earlier to look at AI policies around the world and analyzed gender through that lens. And I can tell you in that one, there was one country that stood out in terms of its gender, attention to AI, and it was Ireland. Canada, we were abysmal. Actually, we were right. Some countries didn't mention women and girls at all in their policies. Ireland mentioned women and girls in very positive and supportive ways. Working on that project brought me into thinking about the biases that AI brings to our work, in particular for women and girls, and also introduced me to some work that I think is particularly relevant for AI, and that is a document from the Council of Europe. I don't have a QR code for this. So if you're interested in this report, I think maybe take a picture of the slide. This is a free open access report. You can download it. And it's on human rights by design for artificial intelligence policy. And the Council of Europe it really helped to shape my thinking around academic integrity in ways that I hadn't anticipated. They think about when we're talking about AI to actually prioritize human rights, dignity, and protections when developing policy. So in other words, when we're thinking about artificial intelligence policy, don't focus on the tech, focus on the people and the impact on the people and how they may be positively or negatively impacted by that technology. There's a quotation on the screen I think that is worth reading, and this says, every month new software in transportation, healthcare, security, and other sectors, often from third countries, bought from third countries. There is no human rights discussion because the public does not understand the risks, and in many countries there are no legal safeguards at all. No legal safeguards for anything to do with AI. This will take us back to the slide where I said we won't be able to solve all of these problems today. But as we're thinking about artificial intelligence and our students being people, what is the impact on our students in terms of their dignity and the impact that it may have on them? So I tried to pull all of this together and thinking about academic integrity through a human rights lens. And I read the United Nations Declaration, or the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The word dignity is mentioned no less than 6 times in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So let me ask you this. When we're dealing or addressing or conversing with students who have an allegation of misconduct, to what extent do we attend to their dignity? This is something that I've never seen in any policy on academic misconduct, and the sanctions that are imposed on students in terms of how might we continue to address students as people and maintain their dignity. I will often say in these presentations that students are not our enemy, but our future. So whether or not they have engaged in misconduct, it is our responsibility also to treat them as stewards of that future, rather than simply as individuals who have done something wrong. I don't have a slide for this, but in Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's an interesting clause that gave me pause. And it said that an individual must be presumed innocent rather than guilty, and must be allowed to have a fair trial. Makes me think about misconduct and how often do we judge a student as guilty before the investigation. I admit, if you see the students with the crib notes, it's hard to not make the judgment. But a presumption of innocence is stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for common criminals. So why wouldn't we extend that to our students? Especially those who might already be disadvantaged and hyper-surveilled. Remember, if you're a man, you're a person of color, and you speak English as an additional language, you are much more likely to be noticed and reported. In particular, for this group of students, how do we attend to their dignity? I'll finish before the quiz, we do have a quiz, with a call to action, and suggest that we can prioritize compassion over content for our students. This does not mean that we absolve them of their responsibility to act ethically, to follow the rules, but knowing again, some students may not even know that the rules exist. We can help them into their development into adults through this. We can prioritize dignity as part of our pedagogy. And I put here dignity over deadlines, in part because I like alliteration, but also in part because I, in my early part of my career, was the most militant person when it came to deadlines. And I would say to my students, you must pass in your work on time, and if you don't, you will be docked marks, because when you get into the real world, your boss will demand that you deliver work on time. And then I would email my editor. You don't need to hear the rest. But we can, in some ways, give our students that leeway. And as a practical tip, I have a colleague, Dr. Meta Schroeder at the University of Calgary, who uses something that I just love, and I want to give her a shout out. She has in her core syllabus what she calls a get out of jail free card. And she puts it in her core syllabus, and she says, you have a get out of jail free card that gives you a 7-day extension on any of your assignments. You can use it at any time in the course. You only get one. And if you choose to use it, no questions asked. Just tell me you're using your get out of jail free card. And she tells me anecdotally, most students don't use their card, but they like to know that they can. And they really like to know that they don't need to say, my grandma's died for the 7th time. So this idea of treating students with dignity is something that we can incorporate. And then finally, prioritizing pedagogy over punishment, because this idea of punishing misconduct, I would argue, is deeply rooted in our colonial foundations of education. And now is the time to challenge that. This brings us to the end of the talk, but there's a quiz. There's a quiz. There's the references. That's the boring stuff. So we'll go back here because the slide's more interesting. Okay, during the talk, something has changed. If you know what has changed, don't say it just yet, but you can put up your hand if you know what's changed. Okay, you might know what's changed. You're sitting really close to me, so okay, you might know what's changed. Okay, anybody else? So there's 3 people in this entire room that said, okay, something has changed. Okay, you, sir, what do you think has changed? Yeah, less punitive, okay. Less judgment, okay. Thank you. If this were an actual test, you would get a check mark for a creative answer, not the correct answer. But well done. Okay, and then there was one over here. Yes. My glasses have changed. Okay. So during this presentation, I took off my actual glasses and put on AI glasses. These have no prescription in them. They do come in single vision prescription. These are in Even Reality's G1 glasses. I bought them in March of this year. And they will do a number of things, including having a built-in teleprompter, which I didn't use. I'm going to put on my real glasses now because I'm getting a headache. But on one of the lenses, you can add notes to these glasses. And I have, for the purposes of demonstration, added notes in the right-hand lens that says this is where the crib notes for the exam go. So my question to you is, if you didn't notice, who among the others who put your hand up, how many of you noticed that I was wearing AI glasses? Okay, most of the people sitting at the front, and some people I know. Okay. If your students had come to class wearing these, would you know? Or if they'd worn them to your exam hall, would you know? The computer is in the back here. I would say if I had long hair, if you wouldn't have been able to tell, for example, if a person was wearing a hoodie or another head covering, you wouldn't have been able to tell. At a certain angle, you can see the screen in them. I will leave them here at the end of the talk so that you can come up and try them. There are ground rules. One, if you have your regular glasses, you need to take them off, of course. Unlike what I'm doing now, they are fragile, so I'll ask you to use 2 hands. And the way that you turn them on is that you look up, turns the screen on, and to turn them off looks down. So if you have a neck problem of any kind and you can't tilt your head up, then this demo is not for you. But if you would like to try them, I will leave them here. So you too can come up and try them. It probably only takes a couple of seconds. There's an app on my phone, and that's where I would put the notes to say this is where the crib notes for the exam go. So I didn't use the glasses to trick you necessarily, although I did. But I also wanted to show you the way that artificial intelligence is not only an app on our desktop, but is increasing in terms of wearable technology. But the question I'd like to leave you with most is, these glasses come in single vision prescriptions. Someone's actually just told me that they now come as progressives, so I may get a pair with lenses in them now. But if your student came to class or came to an exam hall, and this was their only medically prescribed vision correction, and they've arrived at your exam, what would you do? I'll leave you with the question and close there, and I'll leave the glasses on the desk at the end if we want to try them. That's my time. Enjoy the rest of your teaching month.
So we'll take a few questions, and also the slides are going to be shared at the end of today.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think this is a very important topic that everybody should know and understand. My question here, and I'll give it examples, is it ethical to use AI in the academic institutions? And for example, there are ethical challenges. One is bias in AI algorithms. Secondly, lack of transparency in AI decision making. Thirdly, confidential risks in terms of data breaches and unauthorized access. Reliance on AI in legal advice, and inaccurate and misleading information. Now, what really worries me in this AI tools is the application of AI tools in the medical profession. Secondly, the economics in our society. And thirdly, the legal system. And then when you look at all of these, the Playbook movie is like dropping an atomic bomb on humanity.
Yes, is the answer. I agree with everything you've said. Remember that slide at the beginning where I said we wouldn't be able to talk about all the points? Yeah, this is that question. Okay, there's a lot of questions in there. So is it ethical? And thinking about ethics is something we decide together as a community, is what is ethical and what is not ethical, and the different schools of thought around that. I think you've asked the big question, and I'm not sure that there is an answer. I also worry about many of the things that you're worried about. And in terms of the garbage outputs of AI, that continues, and that is something I think of grave concern in education, and thinking about the misinformation and disinformation and the impact of our students on that is something we need to attend to. And I think it's not going away anytime soon. And students still remain responsible for the work that they submit to it, right? So if the papers that they submit have fake or fabricated content, well, that's already been in our misconduct policies for a long time. If you fabricate or falsify information, that is misconduct and needs to be addressed as such. So yes, that's still there, and we have avenues to follow up on misconduct in the institution. As to the other questions, I mean, these are the big questions that the whole world is trying to tackle. So acknowledging them and not having, God, I don't have answers to all those. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, for your presentation. My question is, more practical. So we are talking about academic misconduct or cheating, but how do we define them in the first place in the age of generative AI? One extreme is when the students are writing reports, they can write the draft on their own and use generative AI only for catching the typos, one extreme. The other extreme is they can just give a very simple prompt to write a report for me on topic X. The question is in between. We have an infinite number of possibilities and scenarios. Then how should we define them? Cheating or misconduct in the first place?
It's a good question, and I thank you for the pragmatic question. One definition of cheating is if students have an unfair advantage over other students, so a cheat note in an exam, for example. And if students are not doing their own work, they're here, so think of it very pragmatic terms. Students are here to learn, we're here to teach and assess them, and the assessment can be a representation of their learning. But if there's a disconnect, then what we're assessing isn't their learning. And so the closest analogy I can come to is if someone chooses to offload their work entirely to a third party, in the past that would have been offloading it to another human, do their work for them, a parent, a sibling, a classmate, a friend, a term paper mill. So this offloading, I think what we're seeing in the academic integrity circles, is not necessarily happening as much to other humans, but rather to a technology. And in these cases, the outcome is the same, that the students have used something, a person or a technology, to circumvent their learning instead of doing it themselves. And so there becomes this absence of learning. But if our job is to assess the learning, then what we're assessing is an artifact or an output that doesn't actually represent the student's process. So whether the learning is outsourced to a person or to a technology, the result is still an absence of learning. And so that counts as misconduct because that's what students are allegedly here to do. Did I even come close to answering your question? Maybe? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Eaton.
Sarah.
Question less focused on AI and more on the academic integrity side. A few years ago, I attended an online seminar with probably mostly American colleagues, and there were comments about, I don't have an academic integrity office. Where would I report or take issues? And this was in the context of online examinations, which is my role here at Queen's. And I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of the nature of the support professionals at administration in Canada versus the US. How are we doing in the Canadian education space with centralized academic integrity offices or supports for that versus what we see in the States? Because I know Queen's, we have these departments throughout, and I've been working more closely with one particular academic coordinator who's here, integrity coordinator in my job.
Thank you for the question. I think there are some pretty big differences between academic integrity in Canada and the US. I mean, in addition to the slide that we just put up there, in some American schools they have an honor system or an honor code or a modified honor code, the brief version being, if I've cheated and you've seen me as another student, fellow student, you are obliged to report it. We don't necessarily have that here in Canada, but to your question about centralized academic integrity offices, I am a huge fan. Let me just say that. I wish we had one at my own institution. So far I have been unsuccessful in getting that at my own institution, in part because I think the individuals that work there can serve to support faculty and provide training to faculty. I mean, most of us, when we come into this job, we don't know how to investigate misconduct. That's not what we were trained in. And then especially if you have a role as an associate dean whose responsibilities or portfolio includes case management, most of us got zero training in that. So I think an office can be helpful, and also helpful in crafting consistent institutional messages. So if you have a student who starts in one school and they take an elective in another school, that they're getting more or less the same kind of messaging, and provide some support for students. I know in Australia, for example, academic integrity officers include professionals whose function also includes investigation, case management, and sanctioning. That may or may not be something useful. My opinion, based on being a scholar and advocate in this, is that an academic integrity misconduct could have a decision made by an academic because that's our field. However, the investigations could be done by professional staff. So I think that there's a great case to be made for a centralized academic integrity office to provide support, manage policy reviews, etc. And I only wish my school had them.
And thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. I very much always enjoy, hearing. I've heard you, I think, on CBC and so forth as well. An interesting piece that came to mind is, we're focusing on academic integrity within the teaching paradigm, teaching and learning. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on, there's another component of academic integrity or ethical behavior, and that's responsible use. So to what extent do researchers working in these related fields also, should they and be thinking more in terms of the potential negative ramifications instead of, a sense of just putting it out there and people will do with it what they do?
No, it's a good question, and there are computer scientist colleagues in our field of academic integrity that will talk more authoritatively and in an informed way than I will. But the idea of responsible and transparent and ethical use is absolutely all part of the bigger and broader conversation, and needs to be, including things like the bias that's baked into the models, perpetuating bias, and harms that can come to individuals. I think one of the things that we can even say to students is that, if they submit fabricated or falsified work, always has been, will probably continue to be a form of misconduct, and to teach students to protect themselves as well in that. So yes, the answer is yes, it needs to be part of the conversation. And again, probably could have talked about all this all day, but Gavin and Dale gave me like an hour.
We're going to go to one final question.
Okay.
So this is rather a comment rather than a question, actually. So I want to take the time to thank you again so much for this powerful talk, comprehensive, but also very thought-provoking and inspiring. I think every one of us probably, and I can speak on people's behalf, we've been thinking about everything we've seen, everything we want to do, everyone we want to discuss with our colleagues in the departments and in our schools. So you've covered a lot of things, and I could argue that each one of those could be a topic for discussion. The policies, the human rights, the dignity, the biases, the international versus domestic, and the research data that is lacking, and policies within institutions. And as educators, what do we do in our classrooms and the punishment and everything? There's so many things, just I can add the list. I want to also thank the organizers for the choice of topic and the choice of speaker. And I want to also say, can we do more of this on a practical workshop type of thing? Because I could argue that we need to talk in groups about this and maybe decide on what steps should we take, and are our institutions or departments or administration management would allow us or entertain some of our suggestions or not. So thank you so much.